My name is Evaden Calloway Sterling, though most people call me Eve. I am 71 years old, a retired literature professor who still finds comfort in books, even when the words blur from too much grief. I used to pride myself on being steady, rational, the one who could quote Shakespeare in moments of crisis. None of that prepared me for the moment when the man I loved most slipped away, leaving me with a promise that gnawed at my insides like a half-healed wound. David and I had been married for nearly 39 years. He was 73 when the stroke came sudden, merciless, a thief that left no room for goodbye. By the time I rushed to the hospital in Asheville, his body was fragile, his voice reduced to whispers, but his eyes still carried the intensity that first drew me to him decades ago. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic hiss of machines and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I took his hand, thin and cold, and pressed it between mine. He struggled to form words, his breath catching. Finally, he managed, "Eve, promise me, never go to the ranch." His voice cracked on the word as though the place itself carried a weight too heavy for him to bear. I frowned, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "David, don't strain yourself. What ranch?" His fingers tightened weakly around mine, surprisingly strong for a body that seemed to be fading by the second. "Crestwood, in the Blue Ridge. You must not, ever." His gaze burned into me, insistent, pleading. "Promise me." 1,000 thoughts collided inside me. Crestwood, I had never heard him speak the name. We lived our whole lives together in Asheville, raising our daughter Chloe, building careers, sharing holidays and small arguments and quiet reconciliations. There had never been talk of another property, much less one important enough to be his final request. "I don't understand," I whispered, fighting tears. "Why would you promise?" His voice broke, desperation raw in his eyes. I wanted to ask, to press for answers, to demand the truth. But as I looked at him, I knew time was running out. The monitors beeped in uneven patterns, and his breath came shallow. What could I do but give him the comfort he sought? "I promise," I said softly. The tension in his face eased. He released a long breath as though some burden had lifted. Moments later, his hand grew limp in mine. The nurse came rushing in, but I already knew. The days that followed blurred together funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, Chloe's trembling voice on the phone from Raleigh, the echo of absence in every corner of the house. Yet through it all, one thought persisted. David's last words were not of love or farewell, but of a secret ranch in the Blue Ridge, a place he forbade me to enter. I kept replaying the moment, the urgency in his tone, the fire in his eyes. He could have asked me for anything else: to care for Chloe, to look after his books, to keep our traditions alive. But instead, he made me swear to stay away from a place I had never even known existed. And in the silence of my empty home, that promise pressed heavier than grief itself, daring me to one day break it. Weeks passed in a haze of condolences and routines that felt hollow without David. I tried to keep myself busy, sorting through his suits, making lists of accounts, preparing the Asheville house for a quieter life I hadn't chosen. Yet everywhere I turned, I caught myself expecting his footsteps, his voice asking about the mail his glasses left on the kitchen table. Grief has a way of bending time, stretching the hours so that mornings feel endless and nights unbearable. It was during one of those long afternoons, as I sat staring at a stack of unopened bills, that the phone rang. The caller ID read, "Harrison and Lowe Attorneys at Law." My pulse quickened. Mr. Harrison had handled our wills and modest estate matters for years, a steady, polite man with silver hair and a manner that made everything sound official. "Mrs. Sterling," he said gently when I answered, "I know this is a difficult time, but there is something I need to deliver to you in person. Could you come to my office this week?" His tone was measured, yet behind it lay something else. anticipation, maybe even unease. I agreed, set the appointment, and spent the next 2 days in restless anticipation. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully, as if preparing for a defense. A dark wool coat, my late mother's brooch pinned at the collar. Sensible shoes polished. The drive downtown took 20 minutes, but my thoughts traveled much further, circling back to David's dying words. Crestwood, promise me. Mr. Harrison's office overlooked Pack Square, a brick building softened by ivy. His secretary ushered me in at once. He rose from behind his oak desk, extending a hand with the kind of formality people save for funerals and courtrooms. Mrs. Sterling, he began, motioning me into a chair. First, let me extend again my deepest sympathies. Your husband was a good man. I murmured thanks, settling into the stiff leather seat. My eyes wandered across the polished desk until they landed on a small wooden box and a thick envelope resting on top. I've been instructed to give you these, Mr. Harrison said, sliding them toward me. David left very specific directions. They were to be delivered only after his passing. My throat tightened as I touched the box. It was heavier than expected, the grain dark with age edges worn smooth by time. I lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned in felt, lay a large iron key attached to a tarnished leaf-shaped keychain. Its teeth were jagged, old-fashioned, meant for a heavy lock rather than anything modern. I traced the cool metal with my fingertips. What is this key for? Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Crestwood Ranch in the Blue Ridge foothills. Your husband purchased it about 4 years ago. He left instructions that you were only to know of its existence after his death. The air left my lungs. Crestwood, the word I had heard in that hospital room, the word that had branded itself into my memory. I don't understand, I said slowly. David never mentioned a second property. Not once. According to the records, he reacquired it after many years. It once belonged to his family. Harrison paused, removing his glasses and polishing them with a handkerchief. There is more. I suggest you read the letter. I broke the wax seal on the envelope, my hands trembling. The handwriting on the first line was David's, steady, unmistakable. My dearest Eve, if you are reading this, it means my time ended sooner than I had hoped. Forgive me for the secrets I carried. Crestwood Ranch is yours now. It was once a place of pain, but I tried to make it into something beautiful. For years I asked you not to go there, because I wasn't ready to face it myself. Now I release you from that promise. Go even just once before you decide what to do with it. Inside, you'll find my truth, and perhaps your freedom. The study holds my laptop. The password is the day we met, followed by the word you taught me to feel again hope. I love you beyond words, David. The words blurred as my vision clouded. I pressed the paper to my chest, hearing his voice as though he were still near. My husband, who had lived a life of quiet predictability, had left behind a secret ranch in the mountains and a letter filled with mysteries. I folded the paper carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. The key lay cold in my palm, impossibly heavy, as though carrying the weight of every unanswered question. When I finally rose to leave, Mr. Harrison looked at me with concern. Take your time, Mrs. Sterling. Whatever you decide, know that your husband trusted you above all else. I stepped out into the crisp Asheville air, clutching the key in my pocket. The promise I had made at his bedside was undone by his own hand, replaced by an invitation I could not ignore. Crestwood was no longer just a word. It was a door waiting to be opened. The morning I set out for the ranch, the air over Asheville was sharp with late autumn chill. I packed David's letter into my handbag and slid the heavy iron key into my coat pocket. Its weight, a constant reminder that promises can shift like earth beneath the feet. For weeks, I had fought the urge, telling myself to leave the mystery alone, to keep faith with the man I'd buried. But his letter was clear. He wanted me to see Crestwood, to step through the gates he had once begged me to avoid. The highway carried me out of the city, past brick storefronts and murals brightened against gray skies. Soon the road curved upward into the Blue Ridge foothills, the trees bare their skeletal branches etched against the horizon. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile. What if Crestwood was just a derelict shack, some forgotten inheritance from his family? Why spend his final words to keep me away? The directions in Harrison's folder led me off the main road onto a narrow 2-lane drive. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the forest closed in quiet, except for the hum of my engine. After 15 minutes of climbing switchbacks, the woods thinned, and there it was, a tall wooden gate flanked by stone columns, a wrought iron arch above, spelling in curling letters. Crestwood Ranch. I braked, staring. This was no shack. The gate itself looked newly built, the hinges gleaming black against timber dark with stain. Beyond it, the land opened wide rolling pastures edged by oak trees, their leaves scattered gold across the ground. For a moment, I didn't breathe. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the iron key. Its teeth slid into the lock as if made for that very moment. A click echoed through the stillness, followed by the slow creak of wood swinging inward. I eased the car forward, heart hammering. The road wound through open fields and into a grove of ancient oaks. Then the house appeared rising out of the land like a secret too carefully preserved. It wasn't a farmhouse in ruin as I had pictured. It was a sprawling ranch-style estate stone and cedar siding, gleaming under the pale sun. A wide porch stretched across the front, its beams thick and freshly varnished. The roofline was simple but elegant, pitched against the backdrop of mountains. Every detail looked deliberate, as though someone had poured years into its renewal. I stopped the car in the gravel drive and sat still, gripping the steering wheel. My husband had rebuilt it, and never once spoken of it. The man who balanced our checkbook to the cent, who teased me about buying too many lilies for the garden, had quietly restored an entire estate without my knowledge. I climbed out, boots crunching on gravel. The silence was alive with distant bird calls and the rustle of wind through branches. The house smelled faintly of cedar, as though the timber itself still remembered the saw. The porch steps were solid under my feet. I ran my hand along the smooth railing, the wood warm despite the cold. This was no forgotten property. Someone had loved this place back into life. I turned slowly, taking in the view. Pastures rolled out in every direction, bordered by stone walls. A barn stood to one side, its red siding bright against the gray sky. Fences stretched toward the horizon, straight and well kept. Everything spoke of care, money, and vision. Awe pressed against my ribs, yet beneath it ran a darker current, dread. If he had gone to such lengths, what had he been hiding? What memories had tied him here so tightly he could only face them in secret? The key grew heavy in my coat pocket. Behind me loomed the front door, its dark wood carved with a subtle pattern of leaves. I reached for the knob, then stopped, palm hovering. David had made this place into something beautiful. But beauty never comes without cost, and I had yet to learn what price had been paid to bring Crestwood Ranch back to life. The lock turned smoothly, as though the key had been waiting all along. The front door opened with a sigh, releasing a faint scent of cedar and something floral, sweet, delicate, almost haunting. I stepped across the threshold, my heart pounding in my ears. The entryway opened into a great room with vaulted ceilings and a stone fireplace that rose to the rafters. But it wasn't the architecture that made my knees weaken. It was the walls, Every surface from floor to ceiling was covered with paintings, dozens upon dozens of canvases, framed and unframed, all of them bursting with orchids. White moth orchids cascading like waterfalls, vibrant cattleyas in purples and pinks, rare slipper orchids rendered in careful brushstrokes that captured every vein of every petal. No two were alike, yet all were familiar. Orchids had been my lifelong passion. I had tended them in small pots on our back porch for years, coaxing delicate blooms through seasons of doubt. David always humored me, teasing me about talking to the flowers, but he'd never shared my obsession. Or so I thought. I pressed a hand to my mouth. He had been watching, listening. He had taken the very thing I loved and filled a house with it in secret. The silence deepened as I moved farther inside each step, heavier than the last. In the far corner near a window overlooking the gardens stood a desk of polished walnut. On it sat a closed laptop, silver and clean, and resting on the lid was a single white orchid in a slender glass vase. Its petals glowed in the pale light like porcelain. My hand shook as I reached for the laptop. The weight of it was ordinary, but the meaning felt unbearable. David had written of this in his letter. Inside, he said, was his truth. I set the laptop gently on the desk and brushed my fingers across the smooth lid. The room seemed to breathe with me, orchids swaying slightly in some unseen draft. I drew a deep breath, bracing myself, and lifted the lid. The screen lit up with the faint hum of power, a black field waiting for a password. My pulse quickened. October 12th, 1974. The day we met, followed by the word he said, I had given back to him hope. I typed it slowly, each letter trembling on the keys. The cursor blinked, then the screen shifted to a new page, folders arranged with deliberate care. One stood out, immediately my name. I hovered over it, my finger ready to click, when a sound shattered the stillness. Tires crunching on gravel outside. I froze, breath caught in my throat. Through the wide window, a dark SUV rolled up the drive, dust trailing behind it. The vehicle stopped just short of the porch, and doors opened one after another. 3 men climbed out, each carrying the unmistakable stamp of David's family, his brothers. The screen glowed before me, promising answers, but the sharp knock on the front door made my hand falter. The truth I had come seeking would have to wait. Someone else had arrived to claim it. The knock at the door rattled through the wooden beams, sharp and commanding. I closed the laptop with a snap, the orchid trembling in its vase as though it too had been startled. My pulse hammered in my throat. Peering through the side window, I saw them 3 men I recognized more from photographs than from life. Marcus Sterling, the eldest, stood at the front with his square shoulders and perfectly pressed charcoal suit, even here in the mountains. His hair, once a thick, dark mane like David's, was now silver at the temples, lending him a gravitas that only sharpened the arrogance in his stance. Behind him was Elijah Leaner, restless, his eyes always calculating. He had built a career as a lawyer, and it showed in the way his gaze dissected everything, even the porch rail. The youngest, Isaiah, lingered a step back, his posture, hesitant hands shoved in his pockets. I had met them briefly at our wedding decades ago, then again at David's mother's funeral. But David had never encouraged contact afterward. His silence about them had spoken volumes. Another knock, louder this time. Mrs. Sterling Marcus called, his voice deep, rehearsed. "We know you're in there. We need to discuss the property." I tightened my grip on the edge of the desk. The gall of them. My husband had been gone mere weeks, and already they were at his door. My door like creditors circling. I forced myself to steady my breath and walked to the entrance. When I opened it, I did not step aside. I stood in the frame, blocking the way. Marcus's smile was polite, but cold. "Naomi," he said, using my name with a familiarity that felt wrong. We won't take much of your time. There are matters that need clarifying about Crestwood. Elijah adjusted the leather folder tucked under his arm. This ranch, he said smoothly, was purchased when David's health was already in decline. We have serious concerns about his capacity to make sound decisions at the time. The words cut like ice. Decline capacity. My husband had suffered a stroke, yes, but until that moment, he had been the most lucid, disciplined man I knew. They were rewriting his final years before my eyes, planting doubt where there had been none. You mean to suggest he didn't know what he was doing? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Elijah gave a practiced shrug. We mean to ensure fairness. This property has always been part of the Sterling legacy. David should not have acted alone in reacquiring it. Legacy. The word tasted bitter. He spent his life distancing himself from the three of you. If this place is part of anyone's legacy, it is his. Isaiah shifted uneasily, his gaze flicking between his brothers and me. He said nothing. Marcus's expression hardened. We intend to file a petition contesting the validity of the purchase. The courts will decide, of course, but it would be simpler for all of us to resolve this without litigation. His eyes traveled past me into the house as though he could already see what David had left behind. May we come in? I straightened, letting my hand rest on the doorframe. No. The silence stretched. Elijah's jaw twitched. Marcus's smile returned tighter now, like a mask straining to hold. Naomi, he said softly, we understand your grief. But you must realize this estate isn't truly yours. It was never meant to be hidden away. Something hot surged in my chest. My husband had built this place in secret. Yes, but for me. His letter still burned in my handbag, his words still fresh. Inside, you'll find my truth and perhaps your freedom. He had chosen me, not them. I stepped back just enough to make my position unmistakable. You'll hear from my lawyer, I said. Then, without waiting for their reply, I closed the door. The latch clicked into place, echoing through the quiet house. Outside, muffled voices rose in frustrated discussion, the crunch of gravel as they lingered before retreating. I pressed my forehead to the door, my breath shallow. Grief had hollowed me, but anger was filling the space it left behind. David's brothers hadn't come to mourn or to reconcile. They had come to strip away what little I had left, and I realized then that Crestwood Ranch was not only a gift from my husband, it was a battlefield. The day after the brothers appeared at Crestwood, I drove back into Asheville with a tightness in my chest that felt like a vice. The mountains loomed behind me, beautiful and indifferent, while the city's streets seemed too small for the storm pressing down on my shoulders. Mr. Harrison's office was a refuge of dark wood and tidy stacks of papers, but even there, safety felt like an illusion. He gestured for me to sit, his expression solemn. I won't sugarcoat this, Mrs. Sterling. The Sterling brothers have moved quickly. Yesterday afternoon, they filed a petition contesting the validity of David's will. Alongside it, they filed a lease pendens. The unfamiliar phrase sounded foreign on his tongue. I frowned. What does that mean? A notice of pending litigation, he explained. It's essentially a cloud on the title. Until the dispute is resolved, you cannot legally sell, refinance, or transfer the ranch. It binds the property in place. The words landed like stones in my stomach. So I'm trapped. Temporarily, Harrison said carefully. The petition claims David lacked capacity when he reacquired Crestwood. They argue he was already impaired and acted under undue influence. If the court finds their claim credible, it could unravel everything. I gripped the edge of my chair. Images of David's final days flooded back, the clarity in his eyes, even in pain, the strength in his voice when he made me promise. He had been secretive, yes, but never confused. How easily those men were twisting his silence into weakness. What chance do they have, I asked. Legally, more than none. David's stroke and medical records will be scrutinized. His estrangement from his brothers complicates matters. But we have his letter, the deed, the financial documents. These will help. I nodded, though the words gave little comfort. Mr. Harrison leaned forward. I'll be frank with you. Marcus has resources. Elijah knows the law inside out. They will drag this into every possible court if they think the prize is worth it. And it is worth it, I murmured. The resort. Harrison's brow furrowed. You've heard about that. Only hints, I admitted. What exactly does it mean for Crestwood Summit Resorts has plans for an expansion in the Blue Ridge? Crestwood sits on a parcel that could prove pivotal. Offers have been made already in the millions. Millions. My breath caught. David and I had lived comfortably, but never extravagantly. I had clipped grocery coupons, budgeted Chloe's tuition. And all this time, there was a ranch in the hills worth more than anything we had ever touched. I looked down at my hands, pale against the grain of his desk. I don't care about millions. I care that my husband left this to me. He trusted me to keep it. That's precisely why we'll fight, Harrison assured. But I need you to understand it won't be swift. And it won't be kind. A silence settled. The muffled tick of a wall clock sounded like a hammer in my ears. For most of my life, I had been a professor, my battles confined to essays and the quiet sparring of faculty meetings. This was different. This was mud and blood, a legal war I hadn't asked for. And yet, looking back on Crestwood's porch, on the orchids painted across its walls, I felt something stir beneath the grief. I had promised David I would never go to the ranch, and then he had released me from that vow. Perhaps he had known this moment was coming, that his brothers would circle, that I would need to summon strength I didn't yet believe I had. Mr. Harrison slid a folder across the desk. Read this tonight. It outlines our response strategy. I placed my hand on the folder, steadying myself as though it were a lifeline. Outside the window, the city bustled as if nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a defendant, a target, a reluctant soldier in a war I never wanted, and the battlefield was the last gift my husband had ever given me. The phone call came late in the evening, when the house had grown too quiet for its own good. I had been at the kitchen table sorting through David's medical bills, their sterile numbers mocking the warmth of the man they described, when Chloe's voice broke through the stillness. Mom, she began carefully, I've been hearing from Uncle Marcus. The words chilled me. Chloe rarely mentioned her father's family. She hardly knew them. During her childhood, David had kept contact to polite minimums, holiday cards, unanswered invitations, declined the occasional funeral attended out of obligation. He never bad-mouthed them to her, but his silence had been instructive. And now, suddenly, their voices were in her ear. What did he say? I asked, setting down my pen. There was a pause. He said the will is complicated, that the ranch was part of the Sterling legacy. He said Dad should have involved the whole family instead of leaving everything to you. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. Chloe, your father knew exactly what he was doing. That ranch was his choice, not theirs. I know, she said quickly, then hesitated. But he made it sound different, like Dad wasn't thinking clearly those last few years. That maybe you were too close to see it. I drew a sharp breath. The brothers had already planted seeds of doubt, the same poisonous words Elijah had used on me, capacity impairment decline. And Chloe, still grieving, was their next target. Sweetheart, I said, keeping my voice steady, your father was secretive about some things, yes. But he was not confused. He bought Crestwood because he wanted to, and he left it to me because he trusted me. She sighed. I want to believe that. I do. But Mom Marcus talked about family unity, about how the ranch could benefit all of us, me included. He said it could set me up for life cover debts, give me security. He made it sound reasonable. I closed my eyes. Chloe had never been greedy, but she was practical. At 35, she had chosen a career in academia teaching literature at a university in Raleigh. It wasn't glamorous, and though she never complained, I knew she lived with student loans still trailing her. Her uncles had found the crack in her armor and pressed hard. "Chloe," I said softly, "security isn't found in their promises. They want that ranch for themselves, not for you. They see you as leverage, nothing more." She bristled. "You don't know that. Maybe they just want to reconnect." I barely know anything about Dad's childhood. Maybe this is my chance to understand where I come from. Her words pierced deeper than she intended. David had shut the door on his family so firmly that Chloe had grown up with a blank space where cousins and uncles should have been. Now, in her grief, the offer of belonging must have felt intoxicating. "I understand the curiosity," I whispered, "but remember why your father kept them away. He wanted to protect you from their schemes, their resentments. That hasn't changed." She was silent for a moment. "Then maybe, but I told them I'd think about it." I sat there staring at the half-empty glass of water on the table, feeling the ground tilt beneath me. My daughter, my only child, was being tugged by the very men who wanted to erase her father's last gift. "Please," I said finally, voice breaking, despite my effort to stay calm, "don't make any commitments. Talk to me before you agree to anything." "I will," she promised, though her tone carried more uncertainty than conviction. When the call ended, the kitchen felt colder than before. I folded my arms around myself as though I could shield against the ache rising in my chest. Grief had already taken David from me. Now it seemed betrayal threatened to steal the only piece of him I had left our daughter. The morning after Chloe's call, I drove back to Crestwood. I told myself I was going only to walk the grounds, to breathe mountain air, to remember that David's gift was still mine, even as others tried to pry it away. But really, I think I was searching for proof, for something solid to hold against the words Marcus had whispered into my daughter's ear. The ranch greeted me in silence, the gates swinging open at the turn of the iron key. I parked near the barn and walked slowly across the gravel, the crisp November air pinching my cheeks. The land was still golden leaves scattered across manicured lawns. It felt impossible that David had overseen all of this without a word. I was standing near the conservatory when I heard movement inside. For a moment, fear surged. Had the brothers returned, I pushed the glass door open, cautiously. A woman stood among the orchids, misting the delicate blooms with a hand sprayer. She was in her 50s, broad-shouldered but graceful. Her dark hair pulled into a bun streaked with silver. She wore a work apron with pockets full of clippers and twine the smell of earth clinging to her hands. She looked up, startled but not afraid. "Mrs. Sterling," I nodded, unsettled. "Yes, and you are," her expression softened. "My name is Lillian Jackson. Mr. David hired me a few years ago to care for the orchids. I hope you don't mind my being here. I promised him I would keep tending them." Relief and confusion tangled inside me. "You knew about this place?" "About Crestwood, I've been here often," she said, simply misting a pale yellow orchid. "He came every month, sometimes more, to oversee the work. He loved these flowers, though he always said he wasn't the one with the gift." "That was you." My throat tightened. David had joked about my green thumb countless times, but hearing it repeated here by someone else felt different, like proof that he had carried my passion into a life he lived apart from me. I walked slowly down the row of plants, touching the waxy petals. He never told me about any of this. Not once in nearly 40 years of marriage. Ms. Jackson's face was kind but unreadable. He had his reasons. He wasn't a man to explain himself easily. We worked in silence for a while, the misting sound rhythmic, the orchids breathing in their care. Finally, she set the sprayer aside and turned to me. "Mrs. Sterling, there's something you should know. What you've seen so far, this house, the gardens, the paintings, it isn't the whole of what David built here. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? Her voice dropped. He made preparations long before the illness showed. He said there would come a time when his family might circle like wolves. He wanted to make sure you wouldn't be left defenseless. I stared at her. Preparations? What kind? She hesitated as though weighing her loyalty to a man who was no longer alive. Then she nodded as if answering a question only she could hear. There's a place he called the vault. He showed me once when the construction was finished. He told me never to speak of it unless you needed protection. The word hung heavy in the air vault. My mind raced with images, safes, hidden rooms, buried secrets. Where is it? I asked. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Not here. Not in the open. But when you're ready, I'll take you. Just know it holds more than you may want to carry. I looked around the conservatory, the orchids glowing under the filtered light. My husband had built this sanctuary in silence, layer upon layer of hidden truth. And now, through the calm certainty of a caretaker's whisper, another door was waiting to be opened. 2 mornings later, I met Ms. Jackson at the edge of the orchard, where the frost still clung to the grass in sparkling shards. She had phoned me the night before with a simple instruction: come early. Wear boots. I followed her across the property toward an old tool shed I hadn't bothered to notice before. Unlike the freshly painted barn and polished house, the shed looked weather-worn, its siding gray with age roof sagging slightly. It was the only structure on the ranch that bore no sign of David's careful restoration. He left this one alone on purpose, Ms. Jackson said. Leading the way, she pushed the creaking door open, and the smell of dust and oil drifted out. Rusted tools hung neatly on the wall, their outlines etched into wood from decades of use. She crossed to the back corner and knelt, moving aside a row of empty crates. The scrape of wood on concrete echoed in the small space. Beneath them, barely visible, was a square panel in the floor with an iron handle. My breath caught. Ms. Jackson gripped the handle and heaved. The panel lifted to reveal a narrow stairway carved into concrete. A faint light glowed from below, as if the earth itself was alive. She stepped aside. He called it the vault, said it was meant for you. I hesitated, gripping the wooden frame of the opening. The air rising from the stairwell was cool and dry with the sterile tang of concrete. How long have you known about this? Since he built it, she said quietly. But I've never come down here without him. I descended carefully, my hand sliding along the cold wall. The steps ended in a corridor that led into a wide chamber. Fluorescent bulbs flickered on overhead, illuminating the space in harsh light. It was nothing like the cozy sanctuary upstairs. This was work, hard, methodical, meticulous. A large table stood in the center, stacked with binders and neatly labeled folders. Along the walls were metal filing cabinets, each drawer marked with names and dates. Maps lined one entire side, tacked and taped in layers, red pen scrawled across property boundaries. I moved closer, my pulse quickening. The first map showed the mountain valley surrounding Crestwood, shaded in colored blocks. One swath bore the logo of Summit Resorts, with notations in David's careful handwriting: Phase 1, Lodging Complex. Phase 2, Golf Expansion. And then underlined twice: Crestwood blocks access corridor. Ms. Jackson joined me, her hands folded in front of her. He found out 2 years ago. The resort needs this property to build their second phase. Without it, the expansion collapses. That's why the offers came in so high. I traced the red lines with my fingertip. All at once, the brothers' urgency made sense. This was not sentiment. This was money, millions upon millions. I turned to the table and opened the top binder. Inside were bank records, notarized deeds, even receipts from contractors. all in order, each page labeled with dates. Beneath them lay another folder, thicker, darker. I opened it and froze. Photocopies of emails, tax documents, legal filings, all pointing to Marcus, Elijah, and Isaiah. Transfers through shell corporations, inflated invoices, a pattern of fraud stretching back years. David had gathered it all, proof of their corruption, tucked away like ammunition. I staggered back, pressing a hand to my mouth. He hadn't just renovated a ranch. He had built a case. Why would he do this? I whispered. Ms. Jackson's eyes softened. Because he knew they'd come for you once he was gone. He wanted you to have everything you needed to fight. I stared at the mountain of evidence, my heart aching with betrayal and gratitude in equal measure. My husband, who had kept so much from me, had also prepared more than I ever imagined. On the table beside the maps lay a small notebook with his handwriting on the cover. For Eve. I picked it up, the leather warm beneath my fingers, and felt the weight of his foresight pressing against me. The truth was clear now. Crestwood was not just a sanctuary. It was the keystone in a war my husband had fought silently, and he had left me holding his weapons. I heard her car before I saw it, tires crunching up the gravel drive in quick, impatient bursts. I was in the conservatory with Ms. Jackson, pruning a row of white orchids, when Chloe's voice cut through the glass walls. Mom. I set down the clippers and hurried outside. She stood near the porch steps. Her coat still buttoned her face, drawn with tension. Her dark hair, usually pulled back neatly for teaching, hung loose and windblown. There was no smile, no embrace. We need to talk, she said. I nodded, leading her inside to the great room. The orchids on the walls seemed to lean closer, as if they too were listening. Chloe didn't sit. She paced her boots, tapping the hardwood floor. I've been speaking with Uncle Marcus, she began, her voice clipped. And Elijah. They told me things you haven't. About Dad. About this place. I felt the air thin. What things? She stopped pacing and turned to me, her eyes bright with anger. That he bought this ranch in secret. That he kept it from both of us. That he wasn't well when he signed the papers. Why should I trust you when you're hiding things too? At least they're being honest with me. My heart clenched. Chloe, listen to me. Your father wasn't confused. He was deliberate. He left this place to me because he loved us, because he wanted to give us something safe. Her jaw tightened. Safe. You call this safe? A hidden estate, millions of dollars at stake, 3 uncles I barely know, telling me Dad lied to us for years. Do you even hear how crazy this sounds? I reached out, but she pulled back. Sweetheart, I only learned of Crestwood after he died. I was as shocked as you are. But the men you're listening to, they don't want to protect you. They want to use you. She crossed her arms, her stance rigid. They want me to have what's rightfully mine. They said the ranch was always meant for the family, not just for you. They're manipulating you, I whispered. Her eyes softened for a fleeting moment, the little girl in her flickering through the anger. But just as quickly, the shield came back. Maybe they are, but maybe you are too. How do I know? I drew a breath, trying to steady my voice. Because I was here. I held your father's hand when he made me promise not to come. I read his letter when he released me from that promise. I've walked these halls and seen the love he poured into every corner. You can trust me because I was his wife for nearly 40 years, and I knew his heart better than anyone. Chloe's chin trembled, but she shook her head. You also knew his silences. And now I'm supposed to believe that the biggest secret of his life was somehow, for my good. I'm not sure I can. The words cut deeper than any blade. Before I could respond, the sound of another engine echoed outside. Chloe glanced toward the window. Through the trees, the black SUV appeared familiar now in its menace. My daughter's expression shifted, relief sparking across her face. They're here, she said quietly. I stepped in front of her. Stay, Chloe. Please, don't walk out with them. She looked at me, torn, her eyes glistening. I need answers, Mom. And right now, they're giving them to me. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. Chloe picked up her bag and moved toward the porch. I followed, but she turned at the door, her voice breaking. I love you, but I can't just take your word anymore. And then she was gone, her footsteps fading into the crunch of gravel, swallowed by the presence of the very men her father had spent his life protecting her from. I stood alone in the silence of Crestwood, the orchids staring down from the walls, their blooms beautiful and merciless. What good was an inheritance if the price was my daughter's trust? I drove to Raleigh 2 days later, my nerves taut the entire way. Chloe had stopped answering most of my calls, sending short text. Instead, I'm fine. Busy. Don't worry. The words read like a wall, each letter meant to keep me at a distance. When I reached her apartment, she opened the door reluctantly. Her hair was pulled back into a tight knot. Her eyes shadowed with fatigue. I could tell she hadn't been sleeping well. Mom, she said, her tone clipped. If you're here to convince me again, I don't have time. I stepped inside before she could turn me away, setting my handbag on the table. I'm not here to argue. I brought something for you to see. It's from your father. That made her pause. A flicker of something hope, maybe dread, crossed her face. I pulled the laptop from my bag and opened the folder labeled "For Chloe." I turned the screen toward her. He recorded this for you. He wanted you to hear the truth in his own words. Chloe hesitated, then sat down, her hands twisting in her lap. I pressed play. David's face filled the screen, not gaunt and frail as in his last days, but strong, clear-eyed, the man she remembered from her childhood. His voice was steady. "Hello, my brilliant girl," he said, smiling that crooked smile that always softened me. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. And it also means my brothers have probably found you. I'm sorry for that." Chloe's eyes widened. She leaned closer. "They'll tell you they care about family, that Crestwood belongs to all of us. But you need to know the truth. When I was 19 away at college, Marcus and Elijah used my name on fraudulent documents. They stole my share of our inheritance. When I threatened to expose them, they threatened to implicate me as a willing accomplice. I left home with nothing but shame and anger. I never wanted that poison near you." I glanced at Chloe. Tears brimmed in her eyes, though she didn't look at me. David's tone softened. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with a cerebral aneurysm, a time bomb in my head. The doctors gave me a window, 2 to 5 years. I chose not to tell you or your mother. I wanted our days to be ordinary, not colored by dread. That was selfish, and I hope someday you'll forgive me. Chloe pressed her hand over her mouth, shoulders trembling. He leaned closer to the camera. I bought back Crestwood because it was where I lost everything as a boy. I wanted to reclaim it, to turn a place of betrayal into a place of beauty. For your mother. For you. That ranch is not your uncle's legacy. It is mine. And now it is yours if you choose to honor it. The screen froze on his face, smiling faintly, eyes full of love. Chloe bowed her head, sobs breaking loose. I reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. He should have told us, she whispered, voice raw. But he was protecting us all along. Yes, I said, tears burning my own eyes. And now we have to protect what he left. She nodded, grief and fury twisting together in her expression. For the first time since his death, I felt her hand tighten back around mine. I returned to Crestwood the next morning with Chloe by my side. The drive was quiet, heavy, with the echoes of David's video still fresh in both our minds. She hadn't said much since watching it, but her silence was different now, not the brittle distance she'd kept after speaking with her uncles, but something softer, uncertain, almost humbled. The house welcomed us with its usual stillness. I found myself drawn not to the great room or the conservatory, but to the east wing, where a corridor stretched toward a door I hadn't yet opened. David's words, in one of his earlier recordings, had stayed with me. "There is a space for you, Eve, a place I always meant to give back." The silver key with an etched orchid waited in the top drawer of the nightstand, just as he'd said. My hand shook as I fitted it into the lock. The tumblers clicked, and the door eased open with a whisper of hinges. Light poured in from tall windows that faced the garden. The room was spacious, the walls painted a clean ivory that caught the glow of morning. Easels stood ready, canvases stacked against the wall, brushes sorted neatly into jars. Shelves were lined with sketchbooks and art supplies. Everything arranged with care. I stepped inside, my breath catching. Against the far wall stood a flat archival box. Kneeling, I lifted the lid. Inside lay my paintings. The self-portrait from my final semester of college, the one I had assumed lost after too many moves. Studies of landscapes in bold strokes. The still life of apples that my professor had praised as unafraid of shadow. Dozens of pieces I had forgotten, each one carefully wrapped, preserved as though they were treasures. Tears blurred my vision. David had kept them all. My hand hovered over the self-portrait, painted by a girl who still believed she would make her life in art. I remembered the arguments with myself after Chloe was born, the decision to take the teaching job instead, the easel folded and put away. I had never complained, but David must have seen the loss in me. And he had been quietly gathering the pieces of that younger self, protecting them until I was ready. Chloe came up behind me. She leaned over my shoulder, eyes widening at the colors long hidden. "Mom, these are yours." "Yes," I whispered. My voice shook. "He saved them." She touched the edge of one canvas with reverence. He must have known how much it mattered. I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of it was overwhelming, the years of silence, the secret preservation, the faith he'd had that one day I would need this room. I stood and let the light wash over me. For the first time since his death, grief loosened its grip, replaced by something fiercer. He hadn't just left me a ranch to defend. He had left me myself, handed back the part I had buried decades ago. I set a blank canvas on the nearest easel, my fingers trembling as I picked up a brush. The bristles were soft, unfamiliar after so many years. Chloe watched quietly as I made the first stroke, a single line of color across the white. The room seemed to exhale as though it had been waiting for me to claim it. The art studio lingered in my thoughts like a breath I couldn't release. Each painting David had saved reminded me that grief wasn't the end of our story. It was only the beginning of what I had to protect. And if his brothers thought they could tear apart what he had built for me, they would learn otherwise. I returned to Asheville determined. My first step was finding an attorney of my own, someone unentangled with the family, someone sharp enough to cut through the tangle of lies already spreading through the courts. Mr. Harrison recommended a colleague, a woman named Margaret Neal. Margaret greeted me in her office with a firm handshake and a steady gaze. She was in her late 40s, her dark hair cropped short, her suit crisp and practical. As I laid out David's letter, the deed and finally the documents I had discovered in the vault, her eyebrows arched. "You've got more than sentiment on your side," she said, flipping through the evidence with practiced speed. "This isn't just a property dispute. Your husband left you a fortress of paper. If what you're telling me about Summit Resorts is accurate, Crestwood isn't just valuable, it's pivotal." The word landed with weight. Pivotal. Not just land, but leverage. We spent the next 2 hours organizing binders. Financial records, notarized transfers, emails David had saved exposing his brother's schemes. Margaret worked with quick precision, her pen scratching notes in the margins. "Marcus will throw money at this. Elijah will exploit every legal technicality." But you have the advantage of preparation. Your husband anticipated them, and now will use his foresight. For the first time since David's death, I felt something more than loss. I felt resolve. When I left Margaret's office, the late afternoon sun slanted across the mountains, gold against the blue ridges. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had been given weeks before but never dared to use. The card bore the name James Dalton, Vice President of Acquisitions Summit Resorts. His voice on the other end was smooth, professional. "Mrs. Sterling, I wondered when I might hear from you." I explained carefully that I was not interested in rushing into any sale, but I wanted him to understand. Crestwood was not merely a tract of land, it was the linchpin of their expansion. Silence hummed on the line before he answered. "You've clearly done your homework." "Let's meet," Dalton said, but off the record. I agreed, my hand trembling as I ended the call. David had always been the strategist, the quiet planner. Now I was stepping into his role, one cautious move at a time. That evening, back at Crestwood, I spread the maps across the great room table. Chloe sat beside me, her face still pale from the revelations of the past days, but her eyes were steady. "What are you doing, Mom?" she asked. "Preparing," I said simply. "Your uncles think they can force their way in. I want them to come. I want them all at this table where the truth can meet them face to face." She nodded slowly, and for the first time since David's funeral, I saw a glimmer of his determination in her. The battle was coming. I could feel it in the air, heavy as the storm clouds that gathered beyond the mountains. And when the time came, I would meet my husband's brothers not as a grieving widow, but as the keeper of his legacy. The morning of the meeting dawned gray and sharp, the mountains veiled in a thin mist. I had chosen the formal dining room at Crestwood. For the gathering, a long oak table polished to a quiet shine, its surface spread with binder's maps and the neat rows of evidence Margaret and I had prepared. The house smelled faintly of cedar and orchids, a reminder of why I was here. At 10 sharp, the black SUV rolled up the gravel drive. Marcus emerged first, immaculate in his tailored suit. Elijah followed with a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm, his eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. Isaiah trailed behind, shoulders slumped as though already defeated. A fourth man stepped out with them, lean, silver-haired, dressed in a banker's gray. Marcus introduced him as Richard Chen, CFO of Sterling Investments. Inside, Margaret stood at my right, composed and unyielding. At my left sat James Dalton, the Summit Resorts vice president I'd contacted. His presence had already unsettled my opponents. I saw it in the way Marcus's jaw tightened when Dalton extended a polite handshake. We sat. For a moment, only the ticking of the grandfather clock filled the air. Marcus cleared his throat. "Naomi, thank you for hosting us. We'd like to resolve this matter amicably. Crestwood was never meant to stand apart from the family. You must see that." I folded my hands calmly. David didn't see it that way. He bought this ranch with his own money and left it to me. That's the only truth that matters. Elijah leaned forward, voice smooth. "With respect, Mrs. Sterling, the court may find otherwise. Questions of capacity, intent, legacy, these things are open to interpretation." Margaret slid a binder across the table. "Not when you have notarized transfers, certified bank records, and sworn statements." David was competent. He was deliberate, and he was thorough. Chen flipped through the documents with a practiced eye, his brow furrowing. I rose then, carrying the small remote I had hidden in my palm. With a click, a screen descended at the end of the room. The brothers exchanged startled glances. I projected the map from the vault, its red lines and shaded parcels stretching across the valley. "This," I said, pointing, "is the full expansion plan of Summit Resorts. Phase 2 requires access through Crestwood. Without it, the development stalls." Dalton inclined his head. She's correct. Our projections confirm it. Marcus's composure cracked, his voice rising. That's privileged information. How the hell did you— I had a husband who prepared— I interrupted, my tone steady. He saw this coming, and he left the proof with me. Elijah's fingers twitched against his folder. Even if this is accurate, it doesn't change the family's claim. I cut him off by opening another file, sliding copies across the table. Fraudulent filings, shell corporations, misappropriated funds, your signatures, your schemes preserved in David's vault. Do you want me to continue? The silence was suffocating. Chen's face paled as he scanned the pages. Dalton leaned back in his chair, interest sharpening into something closer to admiration. Isaiah shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, his mask of control slipping. Dalton broke the silence. Mrs. Sterling's Summit would be very interested in negotiating directly with you. Your position here is stronger than I expected. I held his gaze. We'll discuss terms later. First, these men need to understand. Crestwood is not theirs. It never was. The brothers had come to crush me with legal maneuvers and intimidation. Instead, they sat in silence, their empire of arrogance crumbling beneath the weight of their own deeds. And in that stillness, I realized the moment I had dreaded most had become the moment I finally stood tall. The days after the showdown blurred into meetings, paperwork, and late nights poring over documents with Margaret at my side. Yet beneath the exhaustion, I felt something new stirring in me, resolve that carried the weight of David's foresight. The Sterling brothers tried one last time to bluster their way through, but the evidence was overwhelming. Fraud doesn't vanish when laid bare under fluorescent light. Margaret drafted the settlement, and I watched as Marcus's pen scratched across the page with more force than necessary, his jaw set in stone. Elijah's hand shook slightly when he signed, though he masked it with a smirk. Isaiah the youngest was silent as he added his name, eyes downcast, as if he had long stopped believing in the war they were waging. The agreement was precise. They would withdraw their petition to contest the will, rescind the lis pendens that had frozen the title, and sign an NDA, preventing them from leaking any of the resort maps or David's files. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue public exposure of their fraudulent dealings. Their reputations would survive, but Crestwood was no longer theirs to touch. When Margaret handed me the final copy notarized and stamped, my hands trembled. The Ellis pendens is lifted, she said. You're free now, Eve. Crestwood is legally, unquestionably yours. I exhaled slowly, as though I'd been holding my breath since the day David died. For the first time, the ranch felt like more than a battlefield. It felt like home. But there was still Summit Resorts to address. James Dalton returned to Crestwood a week later, his suit sharp, his briefcase heavy with contracts. He walked the grounds with me, Ms. Jackson following quietly, as I explained what mattered most: the orchids, the studio, the untouched hillsides. We don't sell this land outright, I told him, as we sat at the dining room table. If Summit wants access, it will be under terms that preserve its heart. Conservation easements, strict development boundaries, guarantees that what David created remains intact. Dalton studied me then, the maps I spread before him. Finally, he leaned back. It's unconventional, but Summit has a vested interest in avoiding scandal. Your position here is stronger than most landowners ever manage. If you're willing to negotiate within reason, we can agree. The final contract was signed 3 days later. Summit secured partial use rights that allowed their expansion while leaving Crestwood's central acreage untouched. In return, I received a financial settlement that would secure my future and Chloe's without ever selling my husband's legacy away. When Dalton left, I walked through the conservatory alone. The orchids glowed in the afternoon light, each bloom delicate yet resilient. David had always said, I had a way of coaxing life out of fragile things. I realized then that he had been building more than a house for me. He had been building a chance for me to decide what mattered, what was worth keeping, and what was worth letting go. I touched one pale orchid, its petals cool beneath my fingers, and felt the quiet triumph settling in my chest. Victory wasn't in the money or the settlement. It was in knowing I hadn't sold what was never meant to be sold. Crestwood was safe, and so in a way was I. The first time Chloe and I sat together in the great room to watch one of David's videos, the air was thick with hesitation. The laptop rested on the table between us, its silver surface polished by my fingertips. Chloe leaned forward, her arms wrapped tight around herself as though bracing for impact. When the screen lit up, David's face appeared again so alive, it made my heart stumble. He spoke as though he knew we would be together in that room, me holding back tears. Chloe shifting uncomfortably, but unable to look away. His words were gentle, sometimes, playful, often instructive. Each recording was a message meant to guide us through the days, without him a bridge built to span the gulf of grief. It became our ritual. Every morning after coffee, Chloe would drive over from her apartment in town, and we'd watch a new video. Some were short, only a few minutes of him recounting stories from his boyhood. Others were longer, detailing the mistakes he made, the lessons he hoped we would learn, without having to stumble as he had. At first, the videos broke us open. Chloe would cover her face, shoulders trembling, and I would reach for her hand the way I had when she was a child. But gradually, something shifted. His voice no longer cut like a blade, it soothed like balm. The recordings became less about absence and more about presence proof that love could echo beyond the grave. Meanwhile, I returned to the studio. The first brushstrokes were clumsy, but soon the old rhythm returned, the smell of oils, the scratch of bristles on canvas, the slow layering of light and shadow. For weeks, I worked on a single piece, pouring into it everything Crestwood had come to mean, its painful past, its uncertain present, and its fragile, unclaimed future. The canvas grew into a triptych of sorts. On one side, I painted the ranch as David must have remembered it in his youth. Gray timbers, weathered fields, unkempt, a place burdened by loss. In the center, the house as it stood now restored, open the orchids blooming across its walls. And on the far side, a vision of what might come. Chloe walking among the gardens, sunlight falling across her face, the promise of something carried forward. When the painting was finished, I hung it in the great room above the stone fireplace. The orchids framed the scene as though they too recognized what had been reclaimed. Chloe stood with me that evening, both of us silent before the work. She touched my arm. "It feels like him," she whispered. I nodded, unable to answer. In the shifting light, the past and present seemed to overlap all of us, still bound together by brushstrokes and memory. That night, when the house was quiet, I watched the next video alone. David's face smiled through the screen, and for the first time, I didn't cry. Instead, I felt steady, as though his voice had reached across time, not to console me, but to remind me, life like art is built one deliberate stroke at a time. Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge with the scent of rain and wildflowers clinging to the air. Months had passed since the settlement was signed, since Summit's contract secured both protection for the land and a future for me and Chloe. Life at Crestwood had begun to take on its own rhythm. I painted most mornings in the studio. Chloe visited often, her laughter echoing through the halls, her grief softening into something less sharp. For the first time since David's passing, The house felt lived in, not haunted. It was on such a morning, while I was rinsing brushes in the studio sink, that Ms. Jackson appeared in the doorway, her expression unusually grave. "Mrs. Sterling," she said softly, "there's someone at the gate. It's Marcus." For a long moment, I couldn't move. The last I had seen of David's eldest brother was his signature scrawled angrily across the settlement papers. Now, months later, he was here again. I found him waiting on the porch, thinner than before, his tailored jacket hanging loose on his frame. His skin had the pallor of illness, and his proud posture had bent into something closer to humility. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the man who had tried to strip me of my husband's legacy. I saw only a tired, sick man struggling against time. "Naomi," he said quietly. His voice no longer carried the polished weight of a financier, only weariness. "Thank you for seeing me." I didn't invite him in immediately. Memories of his threats, his arrogance, the way he had turned Chloe's head against me for a time, all of it pressed between us. But something in his eyes held me still. Not entitlement, not greed, but regret. "What do you want, Marcus?" He swallowed hard. "To apologize. For the lies, for the pressure, for every way I made David's life harder than it had to be. I was wrong." His voice faltered, then steadied. "I'm sick, Naomi. The doctors say it won't be long." Things look different when you know how little time you have left. The echo of David's diagnosis struck me like a bell. Another man, another brother, facing the same ticking clock. I closed my eyes for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come," I said. "Walk with me." We crossed the gravel toward the conservatory. Inside, the orchids glowed in morning light, their petals unfolding like fragile secrets. Marcus stopped at the threshold, his breath catching. "David did this?" he asked, awe softening his voice. I nodded. Every detail. For me. For Chloe. To turn a place of pain into beauty. He reached out, not touching, only hovering his hand near a bloom. His shoulders sagged. I never understood him. And I hated him for the way he left us behind. But standing here, I see what he built. What he chose. I didn't answer. Words weren't needed. We walked in silence, the orchids, a living testament to David's quiet strength. When Marcus finally left, he didn't ask for anything. He only pressed a faded photograph into my hand, 3 boys beneath an old oak, the smallest, clutching a potted orchid. David as a child already tending something delicate. That night, I returned to the great room. The painting hung above the fireplace, my own attempt to capture the layers of past and future. I opened the laptop one final time. The last video waited. David's face appeared calm and resolute. If you've come this far, my love, then you know the truth. The true inheritance isn't property or orchids, or even this house. It is freedom. Freedom to live as yourself, to create, to forgive, to move forward. That is what I leave you. The screen went dark, but his words lingered woven into the silence. I looked around Crestwood at the paintings, the orchids, the wide beams overhead, and understood. David hadn't only given me land to defend. He had given me possibility, a chance to decide what came next. And for the first time since he left me, I felt that inheritance fully alive in my hands.